Great to have you here. I'm Eleanor Falla. I am a senior product manager in the Microsoft Security Organization, specifically in the Customer Experience Engineering Independent Software Vendor team. Greg, if you could click the next slide. Today we're going to be covering a few different topics, mostly external authentication methods, otherwise known as EAM, but we'll kick it off with a brief overview of Entra ID and then into the external authentication methods feature itself, talk about the principles. We'll do a demo, both managing the EAM as well as using it, and then speak to the roadmap and a little bit more about the providers that we're building integrations with for EAM. So Greg, I'll hand it over to you to do an Entra ID overview.
Fantastic. Thanks, Eleanor. So as Eleanor said, we're going to start out with a bit of an overview of some of the concepts that external authentication methods builds on top of. I think this is probably old hat to everyone on the call, but Microsoft Entra is an identity provider that gives you the ability to manage your identities, to manage access to your resources, to your applications, and to protect all of those. And generally, you'll be doing your protection and you think about your user authentication through a set of authentication methods. These are things like a password or SMS or phone or an authentication app. So as you can see, we have a range of authentication methods that we support for multi-factor authentication to help your users complete 2 out of the 3 of the something you know, something you have, and something you are. We're super excited that hopefully you've seen our recent announcement that we're now making available external authentication methods, providing you the ability to plug in external MFA solutions as one of those options for protecting your user sign-ins. MFA is super, super important, as you can see in the stats on the side. A recent study that was done last year between Microsoft Security, Microsoft Research, and some external research groups as well, showed that during the period studied, over 99.9% of the identity attacks seen in those during that period were blocked by the use of MFA. So super, super important for being able to protect your users. One of the other key concepts that you'll be using when configuring the requirements that external authentication methods plugs into to protect your users is through the use of something called conditional access. Ultimately, conditional access is a way that an admin can define the policies and define the requirements across signals, such as who the user is, what are the roles that they have assigned to them, what is the application that's being or the resource being accessed, in order to set what the right requirement and the right outcome would be, whether that's allowing access, whether that's allowing limited access. Most important for today's discussion is whether that's requiring multi-factor authentication for access or blocking access or whatever those might be. It's the center of the Entra-based identity-driven control plane and really how we think about admins configuring these types of requirements. So I mentioned a couple of the scenarios, but things that we've heard from customers and some of the key places that people are using conditional access and thinking about protecting with MFA are privileged roles where admins are elevating to access privileged actions. So that might be through something called privileged identity management, which is a just-in-time way to elevate to take administrative action, a way to embrace least privilege, or if it's just general sign-in for all admins, if you have permanently assigned roles, or for specific management tasks. There's other functionality like I just referenced, such as blocking sign-in that are risky, either due to user risk or due to the session risk. Or admins can also prompt for MFA if they see elevated risk. So there's a whole set and a range of functionality that conditional access offers, and we're super excited that you can now start to plug in external authentication or external MFA solutions as part of that. So with that background in mind, we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about external authentication methods themselves. So why might a customer want to use an external authentication method or an external MFA solution with Entra ID? We've heard a lot about this from customers over the years, and 2 of the big things that really stick out are, number one, there's a lot of customers that are using ADFS today, and they're looking to migrate to cloud identity, but they already have deployed an external MFA solution. And we know the lift and the burden of trying to retrain users on a different device or a different application, or issuing hardware tokens or issuing physical keys. any of those pieces are significant in terms of the cognitive load, the impact on the user, as well as the burden on admins and support staff to get their users prepped and to manage through that transition. So there's a huge need to be able to take the solution that you already have that's working with your users today, and to be able to plug that in with the power of your cloud identities. We also have customers who maybe weren't already using ADFS, but there's something about a particular authentication product that they really like and they want to use that. And with Microsoft, we're super open to partnership, and we're excited to be able to extend this customization so that customers can plug in whatever MFA solution they want to use to be able to help solve and support some of these scenarios that you can see listed below. The general MFA requirements, that just-in-time role activation, those risk-based policies when session risk seems to be a bit elevated or a user seems to be risky. And in some cases, an application may just require MFA. And so being able to solve for that, again, with that consistent external MFA solution is important. So in order to be able to plug external authentication methods alongside the built-in methods and have a consistent approach for how we think about MFA and Entra ID, there's a few principles that we started with that I'll recap before I go through what the integration looks like and how you'll manage that. One of our starting points was that we want to ensure that external methods are treated as closely as possible like any of the other built-in methods, so that you have as consistent a management experience and your users have as consistent a sign-in experience when there's multiple authentication methods that they might be using. We know some customers will be using multiple external methods for their users. Some customers will be using a mix between the built-in methods and some of the external methods as well. And so it's super important that admins have a consistent visibility, a consistent way to manage those, and users have as consistent an experience as possible. So similarly, when you're setting those requirements, if you have those multiple methods in play through the use of conditional access, through the use of that MFA requirement, you're able to use one set of policies that are able to apply to all of the authentication methods that you want to target for your users. We have built external authentication methods based on a standards-based integration. We've published this integration as part of our public preview announcement over the course of the last couple of weeks to make sure that any provider that chooses to integrate and that you want to use for an external authentication method can be plugged in and can be part of the integrations, can be part of the solutions that you use to protect your users. So those are the principles that we started with. Let's talk a little bit about what we've announced with the initial public preview, and we'll get to the incremental approach, and we'll talk a little bit about the extra additions that'll be coming over time through the roadmap. So initially, the loudest need that we've heard loud and clear from customers is around the need to plug in that external factor and use that to solve for MFA, solve for that second factor. So that's the first use case that we've solved for and that we've announced with the public preview. Admins can create and manage these in the Entra ID authentication methods policy, just as we had talked about, and I'll show you as well the user experience as part of that. So what does this actually mean? It means that a user, when they are starting to sign in to access an app, they'll sign in with the primary authentication with Entra ID. Entra ID will process the authentication requirements, and if there's an MFA requirement that applies, Entra ID will prompt the user with whatever the selections are that are available. In some cases, there'll be a default method available. In other cases, the user may choose amongst options. For the purposes of this discussion, the user chooses to choose an external authentication provider. Entra ID then redirects the user over to that external provider. The provider prompts the user to complete whatever authentication steps that might be. Entra does not mandate any particular authentication method, but does indicate to the provider that the user needs to complete 2 out of the 3, or complete the complementary of the something you know, something you have, and something you are. So if the user completes username and password with Entra, then the user needs to complete a something you have or a something you are, a biometric or a possession-based factor with the external provider. The user completes that, and then the provider sends a ID token back over to Microsoft Entra. We validate that the token meets the criteria, and then issue a token for the user to be able to access the application. The user is able to access the application and move on. So all of what I just described, as you saw there, it's an OIDC-based flow. And so there's a couple of important parts that are required to configure that. There's a couple of pieces that the provider will have set up for the integration prior to an admin configuring an external authentication method in their tenant. The important pieces of information that a provider is going to ensure that you have is what's the client ID that you're going to need to configure as part of that flow? What's the discovery URL that you're going to need? In some cases, for the client ID, the admin may create that themselves and just input that on the provider side as well, so that the provider knows the right client and can validate that. In other cases, the provider may provide the client ID to admins to be able to provision into Microsoft Entra. The other piece that is part of that integration, and in that flow that you saw, Entra passes an ID token hint, which is an ID token over from Entra as part of the auth request to the provider. That's used for discovery. And importantly in that, we need to have an audience that we can issue the token for. That audience is going to be validated by the provider to ensure that it's a valid integration and a valid auth request. In order to create that, there's an application that's going to be created or a service principal that needs to be in the tenant as you configure that. Some providers are going to create a multi-tenant application and provide you an app ID that you'll see in the next screen as you're configuring it. Other providers will actually walk you through or provide automation that'll create a service principal in the tenant with the right properties for you to be able to use that as an integration. So again, that's a provider-specific configuration or step based on how their integration has been set up. And that's guidance that you'll be getting from your provider. So now I'll walk you through the admin experience once you have those pieces of information and you've been working with your provider on how to set up the integration. This is a screenshot of the authentication methods policy experience or policy blade. And you'll see that there's a new add external method button that's at the top in the command bar. So I'll select that add external method button. And then you'll see that I now have the ability to add in the configuration for the external method. I'm going to give the method a name. In my case, I'm choosing a datum, which you'll see later on. Super important to know that the name can't be changed after you initially configure and create that method. But also, this is the name that's going to be shown and displayed to your users, and the method name that you're going to see in the admin UX as you're managing the method as well. So make sure that you're choosing a name that you're going to want to document and share to your users and is going to make sense to them as they're going through the experience and in whatever user documentation that you have. As I said, the client ID, the discovery endpoint, and the app ID are all pieces of information around the configuration that your provider will either provide to you or help you understand on how to create those in Microsoft Entra. The app ID, in order for us to be able to issue the ID token hint and to be able to use that as the audience, does need to have consent in the tenant. So as you can see in the screenshot of the configuration page here, that request permission button is currently grayed out because there's no app ID. Once I put an app ID in there, the request permission button is either going to be enabled, which you'll see on the next screen, or it's going to be turned into a green check mark if that app ID already has consent in the tenant. If the app doesn't and the button is enabled, you can choose request permission to launch the consent flow, and that'll be based on whatever way app consent is configured in your tenant. So if you've configured it so that admins or users who don't have the right roles and permissions to actually grant consent can queue up a consent request, then if I don't have consent, I'll be able to queue that up myself. If I don't have permission, then I won't be able to grant permissions if I don't have the right role assigned. Or if I do have the right roles and permissions, I can just go ahead and consent that app right there during the flow. To have the right permissions to be able to grant app consent, you do need to either be a global admin or a privileged role admin for the user that's trying to create the application. Also, I do want to call out, as I mentioned, that service principal does need to have consent. And so if you don't have consent for the service principal as part of creating the external authentication method, we do still let you save the method so that you can save the rest of the metadata you got from your provider. You can save whatever targeting that you're wanting to set for that external authentication method, but you won't be able to save it in an enabled state. This is a guardrail to ensure that you aren't creating and enabling a method that is not going to be functional for users to actually authenticate with. So if I add in my discovery metadata, I can use the standard authentication method management experience to set the targeting for groups that I may want to include, the groups that are going to be able to use the method, or there may be some groups that shouldn't be able to use that external authentication method. And so I may set those as part of my exclude groups. After I've actually created and updated that method, I can go back and I can manage that method. And again, it's extremely similar to all of the other built-in methods where I can manage whether or not the method is enabled or disabled. And I can update who the include and exclude targets are. I can also update the configuration with the exception of the name. So if your provider, for some reason, has changed their discovery endpoints, they're doing a migration, or they've upgraded something and so they have a new app ID, these are all pieces of configuration that you can change after the method has already been created and is already in use. Once I've created and targeted my method, I'm then going to set my my MFA requirements. So for admin configured MFA requirements, we generally would do that through a conditional access policy. And you can see the conditional access policy management experience here if you're not familiar with it. The part that we really need to focus on to be able to set the MFA requirement is under the grant control. So you can see in the screenshot, I've highlighted the grant controls, and it's the grant access that I want to set the configuration for. And this first checkbox, required multi-factor authentication, is the checkbox that I want to select. You'll also see the require authentication strengths. And if you select require MFA, you'll see that we give you a text nudge to consider evaluating authentication strengths as well, or instead. Currently, as part of our initial release, external authentication methods are not part of the integrated set of authentication methods with authentication strengths. So any conditional access policies or any requirements that you're configuring through authentication strengths or using that as the requirement for granting access, an external authentication method will not be one of the methods that you can use or your users will be able to use to satisfy that requirement. So just important to note, if you already have other conditional access policies in place in a tenant and you're already migrated from require MFA or the MFA grant to an authentication strength, you will need to have the require MFA grant configured in the policies in order for the external auth method to be triggered. The other question that we've gotten sometimes is you also see the users or the assignment section of a conditional access policy. And a question comes in on where or why should I think differently about what the include targets are for the method itself versus the conditional access policy. And so the policy that I'm creating here in the screenshot is an all apps policy that applies to all sign-ins, and I've assigned it for all users. But we know that there may be some cases where there's specific, more sensitive apps that you're requiring specific combinations of maybe a trusted network or a location, or you're only allowing access for certain roles. And so you may be targeting these conditional access policies to a subset of your users, or conversely, there may be specific accounts or groups that you want to exclude from a policy. This is why the management of who's in scope for a particular method and a particular conditional access policy setting the requirements are actually different, and how you should think about managing those differently. The last thing I want to call out before I go through the user experience on using an external authentication method and how it shows up for a user is the sign-in logs. And this, for folks who may have used our previous incarnation of how we were thinking about integrating external providers as part of a conditional access policy, something called custom controls, and you may have heard of. This will be a huge leap forward for you, because what you may have noticed when trying to debug what was going on with an authentication for your users, when did MFA apply, when did it not apply, is that all of those sign-ins were actually single factor sign-ins. It was actually just satisfying a control in a conditional access policy, which did what it was trying to do in terms of directing a user to satisfy that external provider. But what it didn't necessarily do is enable the user to satisfy MFA. And so those sign-ins didn't show up as MFA, and it didn't help you understand necessarily, here's the order of authentication methods that were executed with them. So the really, really exciting thing with this, with external authentication methods, and now just being an authentication method, is exactly what you see in the sign-in log entry. So this is something that I signed in the other day, and you can see I started out with password. I succeeded with that. And then because the Microsoft Authenticator app was the default method for my user, I was first prompted with a mobile app notification, but I didn't want to use that. So instead, I selected to use the external authentication method. So you see that I did not succeed with the mobile app. And instead, I have an external authentication method that's showing up as the authentication method. And if I were to have multiple external authentication methods in my environment, I can also tell which one did my user use because I used a datum. It's showing up in the method detail. You can see that I succeeded in terms of using that to satisfy the MFA. And the result detail indicates that I've now satisfied MFA with that. So this is a huge improvement in terms of understanding what's going on in the environment and just part of the benefit of that consistency that we were talking about earlier. I'm going to walk you through two different parts of what a UX flow looks like. And I'm going through screenshots on this due to a live demo issue. But what I want to call out here is that there's two different things that we're enabling with the initial public preview. And then I'll talk a little bit about the caveats and limitations on as we go through and as we're incrementally getting to our general availability launch. Our initial launch is not integrated with System Preferred, if you're familiar with that. Essentially, it's a way for Entra ID to understand what method and offer or prompt a user with the first method that they're going to use to solve for MFA. The user always has the ability to choose something different, but it's the one that they start with. Because our initial public preview doesn't have System Preferred integration, that means that they're going to be prompted with whatever those other default methods are first, and they'll have to choose and move over to choosing the external auth method to use that during this integration. As I say, that's something that we're going to be addressing in the near future, and so that'll be updated then. The other thing is, again, because the external auth methods are not part of System Preferred, they aren't prompted as part of that initial default user. So first, I'm going to show you what that looks like if you light this up today with your provider of choice, and you don't have any other methods that are initially prompted. So as a user, I enter my username, I enter my password, and then I'm displayed with a set of options for me to choose for my multi-factor authentication sign-in. In this case, I only have one external authentication method in my system that's available for this user, which is my datum authentication method. If, for example, I had multiple external authentication methods, I would see multiple methods in this list, and as the user, I would be able to select amongst them. I'm prompted that I'm going to be redirected to the external provider. I complete whatever that external authentication challenge is. And then upon being redirected back to Entra, the validation, a token is issued, and I'm able to access the application. I'll also show you what it's going to look like if you do have a different method enabled for that user, and it's something that's integrated or is the default method. So first, I'm going to, again, start out with my username, my password. And in this case, I'm prompted to sign in with Microsoft Authenticator first, because that's integrated with System Preferred. So in this case, I'll select I can't use the Microsoft Authenticator app now. And then I get my list of authentication methods that I can use to satisfy the authentication requirement. So you can see that I have my Microsoft Authenticator app, I have my external auth method, and then I also have a couple of other methods. I could use a verification code, or I could use SMS. In this case, I'm going to choose my external authentication method, datum. And again, I'm going to be prompted that I'm redirecting, and then I'm sent through the datum sign-in experience. So on verification, I'm able to again sign in. So this is something that, again, I want to highlight that we're on an incremental delivery. We wanted to make sure that we could start bringing this to customers as quickly as possible, and also bring this for ISVs to be able to start integrating, so that as we get to a general availability, the customers have as many integrations available as possible and have as much choice as possible for any external authentication method that may be available. So as we're on this incremental delivery, what I just showed you is what you have today. We are adding in System Preferred integration. And there's one other caveat that I want to talk about as part of the initial public preview that will also be phasing in as part of that initial launch. So we've talked about System Preferred and default methods. I'm not going to touch on that. The other thing we haven't talked about is registration and proof hub. Registration essentially is the indication from Entra ID on does the user have the ability to use this method. For most methods, for the built-in method, there's a binding of the underlying credential to the user. For an external authentication method, it's really just an indication of can the user actually authenticate with that method. And this is super important because if you're a user that has multiple methods available, if you don't have a method that you're actually able to use, but Entra thinks you can, then we won't enable you to register for other methods. And anytime you hit an MFA requirement, you're actually going to have to satisfy that. So if you don't have the capability of using your external method, say because it's managed registration through an out-of-band process, then that user is going to be dead-ended and not able to sign in to any of the applications they were trying to sign in for that require MFA. That includes registering other authentication methods, because once you have the ability to solve for MFA, you can't add new methods to sign in without actually MFA. So when we add in that registration capability, any user who has already been using it is going to be prompted that they need to register for the method, or if they have other methods, they'll need to go register manually themselves. Or as an admin, you can also mark that your users are registered to use that external authentication method. This is also a way if you're in the middle of a migration and you're moving your users from, say, ADFS, and you're moving them to now be using Entra ID and external authentication methods. As part of that, you'd be able to use that functionality to preemptively mark your users as registered, so they aren't prompted with that one-off registration experience. But again, while you're testing, if you have other methods that are available that you potentially want your users to use, just note that any user who's in scope for an external authentication method, Entra ID is going to consider them MFA capable, and they'll need to solve anytime they come to a MFA requirement, and they won't have an opportunity to register for other methods. So I'll touch on three other roadmap additions, and then I'll hand over to Eleanor to talk a little bit about the partnerships that have gotten us to this point. I've referenced a couple of these already as part of the functionality that you may see otherwise in Entra ID, or you may be thinking about, hey, wait, when do I get to use this with external authentication methods? The first of them is authentication strengths, which is part of the way that we are helping customers get ready for the US government executive order on cybersecurity that came out a couple of years ago. We do have a roadmap addition to add in the external authentication methods as part of that, so that you can move to those authentication strengths-based requirements in your conditional access policies. When we do that, it'll be both enabling them as part of the built-in authentication strength, as well as enabling you to create custom authentication strengths. At that point in time, you'd be able to say, I want to use the password plus my external authentication methods as the way to solve these. And so if you have users that both have built-in and external methods, that would be the way that you'll end up setting a requirement where they're only satisfying MFA through the external methods. The second item, it addresses part of that integration that I started out with. We're saying that our first use case we're solving is using an external auth method as second factor. So we do have a roadmap item for also including primary auth or first factor, which will help for those scenarios where you may be using an external MFA provider for your Entra ID users, and you want to use something that already satisfies 2 out of those 3, something you know, something you have, something you are. So again, future functionality we'll be adding. And then the last one that we know is super, super important for customers is that credential recovery, the automated way that a user can get themselves back into a good state if they lost their password. So again, this is future functionality that we'll be adding in over time as we update. Credential recovery, and if you're familiar with self-service password reset or SSPR, it's a set of methods that you enable a user to say, if I satisfy these 2 things or this particular thing, then I can reset my password. Those methods are currently managed separately from some of the other policies, and so there's additional integration work that we'll be doing to add that in. So with that, thank you very much. I know there's been some questions coming in, so we'll circle back to the questions in Q&A after Eleanor talks about providers and where we are with integrations.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg. So as we announced public preview at the beginning of May, we did announce integrations with 9 identity providers. And EAM is an open model, which means that any identity provider can build an integration. There is no certification process today. So we're always looking to add to this list. And so if you have any questions as you're building your integration, Greg, if you want to go to the next slide, we do have a team of people who are available to support you build that integration directly into Entra. So feel free to use this form to submit to our team. It's aka.ms/EAM provider support. We have a team of dedicated support engineers who are willing to support you with building the integration with EAM. So with that, we'll move into Q&A. We've got lots of great questions. Thank you all for putting things in the chat. Greg, our first most common question was, what is the timeline for getting EAM to GA, and then what is the custom controls deprecation timeline?
Yeah, great questions. So we've just announced public preview about 2 weeks ago. And if you're familiar with the Microsoft release process, we do want to see the feedback coming in from customers around the public preview. And as I mentioned, we have those 2 important pieces of functionality that we're adding into GA. So I don't have a specific timeline to share for GA at the moment, other than to say that I expect it to be coming in the order of the coming months, and that we're very, very motivated to get this to GA as quickly as possible, making sure that it lands addressing any feedback and ensuring that we've got those functionalities in. We know this is super high priority for customers, and so we are going to get it to GA as quickly as possible. And the second question there around deprecation for custom controls. So just as a reminder for those who are on custom controls and haven't thought about the initial announcement from a few years ago when we announced that that wasn't going to GA, is that we also indicated that when we bring the alternative solution, which is external authentication methods, to general availability, we would also start to announce the deprecation timeline for custom controls. So part of the public preview feedback that we're looking into and we're getting from customers is around the effort associated with migrating from custom controls to external authentication methods. So we don't have a specific timeline to announce at the moment for custom controls, other than to say that when we get to general availability in the coming months, that we'll announce the deprecation timeline then. I would say, though, that there are significant benefits with the external authentication methods and how it enables users to satisfy MFA. And so we do expect that this is the time to start evaluating EAM and the different ways to configure it with policies and start to prepare and think about what that migration looks like for your users.
Great, thank you, Greg. Another question. Are there plans to include this for Entra external ID customers?
Great question. And I didn't explicitly call it out in the presentation, but just to be explicit, is that external authentication methods is currently supported for workforce scenarios, whether that's member or guest, although there is work on a provider as part of that integration when they're doing discovery to ensure that they're also supporting guest scenarios. We don't currently support external ID or what we've thought of as our SIAM product, the recently announced product. That is something that is also a roadmap item, and we'll be updating timelines as we have prioritization and line of sight on that.
Great. Another question. Can we pass risky signals or risk sign-in risk signals to external authentication vendors?
Yeah, great question. So the external authentication methods really is around requesting a particular authentication to happen as part of that MFA flow. And so we've had conversations with some of the vendors about the exact scenario that you're referencing on where there could be risky signals that are passed in either direction from Entra to the vendor or vice versa. That's something that we're thinking about. What's the right way and the right approach for that type of an integration? It's not something that's currently in external authentication methods.
Perfect. Another question. Are AMR claims mandatory in the ID token?
Yep, great question. So there are two claims that are super important as part of the integration, and we can drop the integration guide into the chat at the end of this if you haven't seen those already in our public documentation. One of those claims is the ACR claim value, or the auth context class reference value, which is setting the context on the something you know, something you have, etc. So you'll see there's values like possession or inheritance that are coming part of that. The second part of that we do request back from the provider and needs to be part of the ID token that we get back is an AMR claim value that matches what we're validating.
Perfect. Another question that came in. Will it be possible to register and enroll an EAM and reset factor through Entra, or all EAMs need to be already registered, enrolled, and reset prior to being used for verification?
Yeah, great question. So I think basically this is asking whether or not Entra ID will also manage the registration of whatever that underlying credential with the external provider is, or if that's all done through the external provider. And that's all done through the external provider. So it'll depend on what that provider is, on whether or not, and the functionality they provide, on whether or not that needs to happen prior to a user being included in the scope for the external authentication method, or if that's something where they may have an inline or a just-in-time proof-up type experience, similar to what we have with Entra ID, where the first time the user hits the requirement, they're able to add that credential for their account at that point in time.
Another question, can the CA policies apply to specific apps only or groups of applications rather than groups of users?
Yeah, so in the configuration that I targeted, or I was showing you an all apps policy, but there are as part of the ability to configure this, essentially CA policies are assigned to resources or applications. And so you can target much more granularly than an all apps policy. And you can also then target that with different requirements as well. So for a particular application, say for administrative users, you could have a different set of conditions that apply for them to get access compared to, say, a non-privileged user.
Awesome. Since EAM requires conditional access to implement and thus requiring a P1 license, are there any plans to make this part of the free license tier?
Yeah, good question. Currently, EAM is planned to be part of the P1 license as part of the advanced configuration around authentication. We do have a really rich set of built-in authentication methods that we provide as part of that free tier. And if there's a reason why some of the built-in authentication methods or the Microsoft Authenticator app don't seem like the right fit, then you can also always use integration with things like software oath tokens for bringing in third-party as well there.
There are a couple questions around tenants and availability. Can you speak a little bit more to when this will be available in all tenants?
Yeah, so external authentication methods should be available in all tenants. You should be seeing it in your Entra Admin Center when you go to the authentication methods policy experience or the policy blade. If you're not seeing it there, then definitely you can reach out and we would like to investigate why you're not seeing it. It is fully deployed at this time in the commercial cloud.
Does this capability work with external federation?
Good question. So external authentication methods and federation are essentially parallel concepts. So if you were to have, I suppose, a conditional access policy and identities where you completed sign-in with single factor through a federated identity, and then you also had an MFA requirement, you could attach an external authentication requirement on top of that. But in general, the way that we think about it is external authentication methods are for where the identity is originated out of Entra ID, and you're trying to add in the external requirement there. Whereas when you're just purely federating the ID and it's going to be wholly owned out of that federated provider, that's where you would use external federation.
Can you also use this as enforced authentication for Azure B2B customers?
So I think the question is essentially asking if I have a relationship set up where I have a guest user or I have a B2B relationship between Azure environments and I'm setting up a MFA requirement there. So I'm trusting MFA from another tenant. Can an external authentication method satisfy that? Or conversely, if I have an incoming user, can I use that to force them? If that's understanding the question correctly, and please feel free to add back into the Q&A chat if I'm answering the wrong question. But if that's the question, then the answer is yes. Ultimately, when a user satisfies MFA with an external authentication method, they're satisfying MFA from an Entra perspective. So if you think about it from the nuts and bolts, ultimately Entra ID is going to issue a token with an MFA claim, whether it's an external authentication method or if you used a built-in method, such as you were using the Microsoft Authenticator. So for the receiving tenants, both of those are just MFA has been satisfied.
Another question, our provider requires an ID token certificate. Where can I get that in Entra?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
No problem. Maybe if you want to know more about that, add in the chat. Another question then, when will it be available in GCC High?
Yeah, great question. So we have started the initial public preview with the commercial clouds. We do have GCC or the Gov Cloud integration for external authentication methods that are in flight. So I don't have the exact timeline on that now, other than to say that our deployment process is underway and it'll be in the Gov Clouds very shortly.
Great. Is this only for MFA providers, or can this be used for OIDC or SAML auth providers?
It is. So it is OIDC based only. So in terms of a SAML provider, you would not be able to integrate in a SAML provider directly back in. You would be able to plug in any provider that supported the integration. So like I mentioned, this is expected to satisfy a set of claims that are set with the context of the something you know, something you have, something you are, complementary to whatever the user did with the primary author, that first factor, and validating and then sending the claims back to Entra ID. So any solution that is integrating in and validating that authentication and then sending the right token back to Entra ID would be able to be plugged in.
Awesome. If we see the EAM tab, but it is disabled, does that mean we don't have the right license level?
Yes, so if you see the button for an external authentication, adding an external authentication method in the Entra Admin Center and it's disabled, then I would say double check your licensing. The likelihood is that you don't have an Entra ID premium license. And you can check your licensing from the Entra ID overview tab.
With the less secure nature of the implicit flow, which exposes tokens directly to the browser, what are additional security layers or methods to protect the tokens when using the implicit flow that are supported by Entra ID?
Yeah, so this is a good question. We are using the implicit flow as part of the integration. And so this is something that we're doing as part of exchanging and requesting an ID token from the authentication provider as part of the user being authenticated as part of that. So there are fields that are part of the ID token that are requested, and there are fields that both Entra will be validating from the identity provider that are coming back, and that the provider itself is also validating. So between things like nonces and timestamps, audiences, etc. So we've been through our security review on this and have validations in place to prevent issues.
Follow up on the B2B question. Is that true for both B2B direct and B2B collaboration?
The short answer is yes, it should be applicable to both of those. in both cases, it's an MFA requirement that you're setting as part of that. And so either if I'm not sure if the question is, and perhaps they can add a bit more context on whether or not they're thinking about a scenario where it is the home tenant that is using an external authentication method and you're trusting the MFA from it, or if it's a case where you're adding in an additional MFA requirement that's going to be owned out of the resource tenant. In either case, though, the right things happen, so to speak, for we're able to support a guest coming in that didn't have MFA, but you're using external authentication methods in the resource tenant, and that's now able to be supported again, modulo the provider also supporting the right pieces of discovery, because ID tokens are slightly different for a member or a guest. And then the same thing is if you were just to complete it within your home tenant using an external auth method, then that also would work.
Can an external authentication method remove the credentials of a user or only be used to grant credentials?
If the person asking could add a little bit more context, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I mean, essentially, an external authentication method is an additional credential or an additional method that the user has as the ability to sign in. So it's neither removing or granting credentials on its own. I will note, and I didn't call it out in the presentation, but external authentication methods are slightly different from the built-in methods in that as an admin, you can actually go back and you can delete the methods in addition to just being disabled. So as you saw, and if you go through and are managing, you start out on your authentication methods management experience, and there's the set of built-in methods that are, as they say on the tin, built in. And then beyond that, any external authentication methods that you add are additions into the policy or additions into the tenant that are options that are available for whatever users are in scope or out of scope. If, for example, you were to use provider one and you've decided that you're no longer wanting to use them and now you're migrating to provider two, or you're migrating to just use the built-in methods, once you've migrated all of your users, you actually just go back and delete that method out of your authentication methods. And that'll help ensure that you aren't necessarily offering that to any of your users through accidental misconfiguration on bringing somebody back into scope to that, or that you have essentially clutter in the authentication methods policy.
Perfect. And then just confirming, you mentioned that EAM can now be utilized in PIM when admin elevates their role. Is that statement correct?
Yeah, so if you have a PIM configuration where you're requiring MFA on role activation, then as part of that, an external authentication method can satisfy MFA.
Sounds great. I just want to say thank you all so much for the fantastic questions in the chat. We're going to wrap up for today. If you do have any follow-up, please reach out to us, let us know, and we'd be more than happy to take any feedback or answer any additional questions. But thank you all so much for joining and looking forward to the partnership for external authentication methods.